For those of you interested, you could look up a paper that I wrote along with Dr. Siddiqui several years ago called The High Cost of Cancer Drugs and What We Can Do About It in the Mayo Clinic Proceedings. My experience in giving this talk comes from the fact that I've done a lot of regulatory trials and worked with companies on several new myeloma drugs, and I can see how the price of these drugs have increased over time. If you take myeloma alone as a cancer, in the US, there are 30,000 patients diagnosed each year, and the total lifetime cost to treat all these patients is over $20 billion, and that was 5 years ago. And this excludes our hospital costs, laboratory imaging, and all that. And that's mainly because the cost of each drug that we use to treat myeloma is very high, whether it be immunomodulatory drugs, proteasome inhibitors, monoclonal antibodies, they're all highly priced. And we also use them together in combination, which means that the price goes up for a particular regimen. In the US, the costs of VRD are $200,000 a year. And when you add monoclonal antibodies, this goes up even further. And plus, in myeloma, we give maintenance therapy with lenalidomide, which is expensive, and that goes on for month after month, year after year for many years. And as patients live longer, the overall cost of care goes up considerably. We're now seeing quite a few new drugs, bispecifics, immunotherapies like CAR-Ts, priced at very, very high levels. CAR-T costs $400,000, and then that doesn't include the hospital costs. And even with that price, the drug is hardly available. At the Mayo Clinic, we can give CAR-T therapy to maybe 2 patients a month. So when that kind of money can be made in the US and the drugs in high demand, you can imagine that these immunotherapy drugs are going to take, particularly CAR-T, are going to take quite a while to get to the rest of the people in the world. And that's more than just a cost issue, it's an access issue as well. Now, this is not unique to myeloma. Here is a list of various drugs that were approved for various cancers. All of these drugs are expensive, all of them. All of them cost $100,000 or more a year. And gene therapy is going to be in the millions. So there doesn't seem to be a ceiling, and the high cost has 2 problems. Because of the high cost, a lot of the investment goes into manufacturing and distributing drugs, which are hard to make, is going to countries which can afford to pay for it, which means poorer countries get left behind. And the second thing is that the high cost itself is unaffordable for many patients, if not governments, to bear. The price of these drugs is not uniformly high. It varies country to country. As you can see here, the US has the highest cost. Country like India, where many of these drugs can be made locally, has the lowest costs. And then Europe and other countries are in between. One of the reasons when I look at a country like India and why the costs of certain drugs is so low, it goes into how many companies make the drug. For example, thalidomide, lenalidomide, pomalidomide are very inexpensive in India, costing only $20 to $100 or so a month, whereas they cost thousands of dollars in the US. And this is because there's only one company making these drugs in the US, but many, many companies, 15, 18 companies making these drugs in India. Pharma companies say that the high prices of drugs are justified because it takes a lot of money to develop a new drug. The new drugs provide a lot of benefit and therefore they're worth it, and that we should not interfere with market forces, and that any attempt to control price will stifle innovation. However, I would argue none of these are really valid. It doesn't cost as much to develop a new drug as pharma companies estimate. New drugs, many of them work only for a few weeks or months. They're not like blockbusters like imatinib. There are no market forces in countries like India, in countries like the United States, because you have one company making the drug and they have monopoly for many years, so there's no market competition. And then because they're able to sell every drug at a high price, there's no real incentive to manufacture a real blockbuster drug, which requires more risk taking. So let's examine why are prices so high. Clearly, we have a vulnerable cancer population, and patients are willing to pay anything to get access to a good treatment. There's monopoly. One company makes the drug, and that drug, they have patent protection for several years. And in a disease like myeloma, even if there are 5 drugs or 10 drugs to treat myeloma, each drug is in effect a monopoly, because just because somebody failed VRD and daratumumab, we are not going to say no need to try bispecifics or no need to try CAR T. We are going to still try those. So we're going to try every drug. And as long as we're going to try every drug, then every drug becomes a monopoly. There's patent evergreening. The patent life might be 5 years, 10 years, but then companies are able to sue, pay for delay, and various tactics to prevent drugs to prevent patent from ending. And that means generic and biosimilar process is slow, one, because of the patent laws, secondly, because of the approval process for generics and biosimilars is slow in many countries. And then, of course, there's pharma lobbying. Pharmaceutical companies spend a lot of money lobbying lawmakers to not make laws that would cause prices to be controlled. So what are the solutions to solve these inequalities? Because clearly some patients are able to get the best care because they are well insured and they are in America. And then there are some patients who are not insured and they are in America, but they are not able to get good care. In other countries, there's problems because of access. The drugs haven't been approved, or because the high costs are not affordable by patients. So what are the solutions? One is that in most developed countries, there is value-based pricing, and this means that the price of a drug, the absolute top price, the ceiling price for the drug, is set by various organizations to be proportional to the value it provides. So that if a drug works for 1 week, you cannot ask the same price as a drug that works for 1 year. There is no value-based pricing in the US. Medicare cannot negotiate the price of drugs. And this causes a problem not just for the US, but also for the rest of the world. And that's because if prices can be set at a very high level in the US, prices can be increased every year in the US, then it reduces the bargaining power for other countries to negotiate for lower prices with these pharmaceutical companies. Every cancer drug that has been introduced since 2016, 2017 has been priced over $150,000, over $100,000 a year, average price $150,000. And as I said, US pricing policies affect the rest of the world because the companies could say that the price you're asking is too low and that they would walk away from any negotiations because they can go back to the US and increase prices, which they have done. And as you can see here, Revlimid and pomalidomide, price of lenalidomide started at about $29,000 in $29,000 in 2006 and increased to $69,000 by July of 2018. Every year the price goes up. Same thing with pomalidomide, from 49,000 to 79,000, and that's much more now. But because of this, we really need to clearly see that if value-based pricing and Medicare negotiations were implemented in the US, it could help other countries as well as Americans. Number two is to facilitate easy entry of generics and biosimilars. Now, we've seen here that the more generic manufacturers for a given drug, like if there are 10 people making a drug, then the price really falls. On the other hand, if there's only one generic manufacturer, the price doesn't fall as much. And so we really need to encourage generics, but not just one or two companies, but many companies. Generally, 4 or more companies is needed to lower the price. It'll be good for many drugs to have non-profit generic biosimilar manufacturers. There's one in the US that started a few years ago called Civica RX. Now, generic non-profit biosimilars manufacturers would then manufacture drugs just to make sure that people have access. Whereas if there are many for-profit generic companies, some of them are also selling very high-priced drugs. And what can physicians, professional organizations, institutions do? Because many of the ones that I suggested requires huge policy changes. What we need to do is to choose the best available option. By using careful choices, we can actually provide almost the same care to our patients. And then in 5 or 6 years, the new drugs that are new today would become old, and you can get them at a lower price. And we have addressed this, Dr. Jean-Luc Caruso and me, in a paper called Next Generation Myeloma Treatment. You can check it out on Blood. But basically, for example, in a non-transplant candidate in the US, we would use VRD or DARA-RD. But VCD or bortezomib cyclodex would be very reasonable and is almost many times lower cost and would solve some of the initial cost problems. Similarly, for transplant candidates, if you have access to VRD at a reasonable price, fine, but otherwise using VCD, bortezomib cyclodex could solve. So intelligently using regimens can help. Also, maintenance therapy. In a disease like myeloma, where we give maintenance year after year for many, many years, every year's cost is a lot, but we can reduce that cost by using a fixed duration of maintenance or using maintenance based on response or MRD assessment and get almost the same mileage. Secondly, we need national guidelines, treatment pathways that incorporate value, and we have to hold experts and societies to higher standards. For example, when we look at supportive care for myeloma, you can use the $70 zoledronic acid or the $2,000 denosumab, and I've been arguing that even though both drugs might be the same in efficacy, one is 10, 20 times more expensive. So we really should support the lower price zoledronic acid and not say both of them are reasonable. Third, always support the lowest cost options. Choose generics and biosimilars when available. These are generally made by good companies, generally far less expensive, and we need to support them. And that's when you will have more generics and biosimilars available. And then finally, we need to conduct some strategic trials so that we can reduce costs. So for example, even in a country like Switzerland, where it was very expensive to use pomalidomide, Dr. Zander did a trial where they gave every other day pomalidomide, and that reduces cost. Or do a duration of therapy that's limited. Myeloma treatments can go on for years, but what if you could get the same benefit with a year of therapy or a year and a half of therapy? Response-directed therapy, so you can stop the treatment when you achieve a certain response endpoint, and then you can watch. And then if we can cure myeloma, the cost will go down. So many of us are doing trials in the smoldering myeloma space, trying to see if we can cure myeloma in the front line. So as immunotherapy comes in, it's going to be extraordinarily expensive. It's also going to be extraordinarily difficult to get because the drugs are hard to make and the amount manufactured is hardly enough for the US, particularly CAR T therapy. So domestic manufacturing, domestic capabilities, signing agreements, and using optimal frontline treatments so that you can push the need for these immunotherapy approaches till later would all be important. I have written a paper on how we translate what looks like a great trial result to reality in a paper with Dr. Philippe Moreau in The Lancet, and I'd encourage you to look at that as well.